So Atari was one of the fastest growing companies ever in America. No one had ever seen anything like it. And it was just this new, exciting business, and people for the first time realized that video games were going to be a big thing. But the implosion was so massive and so quick that it almost brought down video games entirely.
Atari was sort of like the dark side of hippie culture. Bunch of dudes working out of a warehouse, bunch of stoners, some really talented programmers. Come 1976, they were ready in production on the VCS, which would later be the Atari 2600.
So Atari has this idea for a console with interchangeable cartridges, and they want to get it out on the market, but Fairchild Semiconductors, this other million-dollar company who's into semiconductors, obviously, put one out. And Atari sees it and they say, we got to get out there now before this hits it big. This is our idea.
So what they did was they went to Warner and they said, hey, come in with us, buy out our company and put some money in and we can put out this thing and we'll make a lot of money together. So Warner puts in like $30 million to buy the company. Then they put in like another $100 million to get this thing out on the market in time for the big holiday season.
So ultimately, Atari selling themselves to Warner worked because we've never heard of Channel F. But that sale and that success came at a price.
Realistically, the hippie culture that permeated Atari wasn't conducive to making profits. And they needed to go through some changes.
So Nolan Bushnell, he's the founder. He also started Chuck E. Cheese. He gets forced out. They beam in Ray Kassar from corporate headquarters, and he is a total button-down suit and tie guy, and he's going to turn everything around and make this a traditional by-the-numbers company. No more coming in at noon, no more smoking the reefer in the office.
It was a culture clash, and in a lot of ways, it destroyed what made Atari so great in the first place.
So from these starting irritations, like having to wear socks to the office, other problems grew out of that. The guys who were making the games, they were getting paid maybe 30 grand a year. And they would say, hey, I'm making this game. You just made $10 million off it. Can I get a little bonus? Can I get something extra? No, nothing.
Kassar wouldn't let the people who made the games take any credit for their work. Like, their names weren't mentioned on the game anywhere. They were just basically programming monkeys, and, you know, the credit went to Atari.
Game design at this point is maybe not appreciated as the art it is today. Even today, I think people still kind of look at it as just programming, and it's not. There's a lot of choices to be made on a creative level. And they didn't really understand that at the time. So the designers weren't particularly well paid and they weren't respected.
Atari's top game makers, you know, went to the brass and tried to get some more money, you know, some royalties from the games they made, and, you know, it never worked out. So a bunch of the top designers left Atari and went to make their own company.
And they actually do it. They leave and they start Activision. And Activision starts making and selling games for the Atari 2600.
Which nobody saw coming. Atari certainly didn't see it coming. And now this has never happened before. And mind you, this is a big thing.
Atari never thought that could have happened, that their designers would leave. Like, if they left, they'd be like, okay, well, you just don't have a job. I don't think they thought they were smart enough to be like, well, I don't think it's illegal for us to create our own games.
It's not just that some guys were leaving Atari, it's that the best guys were leaving Atari, and they were making great games like River Raid, like Pitfall. They were making better Atari games than Atari was making.
And they actually earned royalties on the sales of their games. So people were more invested in the work they were producing. It almost seems like a no-brainer.
David Crane, who created Pitfall always says David Crane's Pitfall. Like Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather, you know? He put his name on it. It was his work.
The crazy thing is, within 2 years after Kassar showing up, Atari became the fastest growing company in the history of the United States.
And in 1982, Activision replaced Atari as the fastest growing company in the history of the United States.
Well, that just opened the floodgates. Then everybody and their cousins started a game company and started making cartridges for the Atari 2600.
Once Activision's out there and people realize, hey, I can get rich making games for the Atari, they still need to learn the same lesson Ray Kassar did. Video games are an art form. You can't just make one with no thought. You need the right people to do it. And there's just a flood of terrible, terrible games for the Atari, to the point where it becomes impossible to separate the wheat from the chaff. You don't know which are the good ones and which are the bad ones. People start to think that Atari is just garbage, because that's what most of the things were on it were garbage.
Now, with all these really bad games flooding the market, Atari says we need to do something to cut through the clutter. We're gonna pull out the big guns and do some really big A-list titles. The first one is Pac-Man.
People were psyched. Retailers were clearing shelves for this game. They produced 12 million copies when only 10 million systems were in existence, thinking that Pac-Man was actually gonna sell more systems. I mean, it was gonna be that big.
Unfortunately, they thought it was just the name Pac-Man was enough. That was enough. The product itself was not that good.
It flickered, it had slowdown, it didn't even look like the arcade version. No, the sound effects were awful. Everything that they could have failed on this home Pac-Man, they did.
So that was the first ace up the sleeve. That went, boom, nowhere. The second ace turned out to be the second nail in their coffin. That was E.T. the video game.
When they decided to make the ET game, around June, July of 82, when they wanted the game to come out, Christmas of 82.
Now this is a classic example of the artist versus the corporate guys. The corporate guys say, hey, we just signed a deal with Spielberg. We got to get an E.T. game out there. And the artists say, okay, we'll make a game. It'll take us 6 months. And the suits go, 6 months? F that. You got 6 weeks. We got to get this thing on the trucks and on the shelves so we don't miss a day of the holiday shopping season.
It'd be insane if a movie producer bought the movie rights to a book and was like, we have to make a movie about this. We have 8 hours. You know, and that's basically what they did with E.T.
So 6 weeks go by, and they end up with something. I don't know if you'd really call it a game, but it was on a cartridge, and it had something that looked a little like E.T., and he walked around and fell in some holes. But really, it was really one of the worst games of all time.
The root of all these problems is just a lack of respect for the design of the games. And they look at them and they're like, moving blocks or moving blocks? What's the difference? They thought everyone has to have this game. But when the game's garbage, no one needs to have it. You know, it's just, they're basically selling a box with E.T. on it.
Atari was left with more than 2 million unsold cartridges that were returned from retailers. They just dumped them in a landfill somewhere in New Mexico.
So just like that, the golden age of Atari was over. They had lost the hearts and minds of the people.
By the end of 1983, Atari had just completely tanked. Initially, they posted a $350 million loss. By the end of that year, grew to over $530 million.
So Warner says, we got to get out of this business. This is killing us. So they break up the company, they sell different divisions off, and the Atari name bounces around for years, being bought and sold. Eventually it's bought by a French company. That's where it is today. And people don't realize that the Atari name they see today has nothing to do with the original Atari company. Somebody just bought the intellectual property rights to the name.
You know, I guess the lesson of the whole story is just that it's just to look at video game design as an art form. It's not something you just put out in a factory. You need smart, creative people to do it. It's its own medium.
That's a main rule of thumb when you have a company. Do not crap on your employees, because you make them unhappy, they're going to leave. And they're going to, they're going to come up with other ways to make money doing what they do.
The lesson to be learned here is treat your employees well or you risk dying.